when I came to Buffalo in 1972 from Wisconsin, um, I was I was struck by the diversity in the area. So I visited the Tuscarora Native Americans up near Niagara Falls, and I did a series of programs with them called Nation Within a Nation.
Wow.
And then I did a kind of my own informal porch to porch survey in the Fruit Belt, which at that time was where Black Americans lived. I don't know what that's like today, if it's still that way. Anyway, I found out what people were interested in, and I was fascinated by what I was learning. And so I did a series of programs, which at that time, now remember it's in the 60s, was
Yeah.
to be Negro. But the idea was, what is it like to be a person of color in, in Buffalo or in the United States?
Right.
And we're now just doing more of that um, as a result of the George Floyd um, Black Lives Matter issues. So I was doing that back then
Hmm.
because sometimes people talk about giving voice to the voiceless. They have a voice, um, of course, but it's amplifying that voice that was never heard. So that was a very important part for me in influencing what I wrote in the mission statement. So then we established a studio down on Jefferson Avenue, which was the heart of the Black community, and 27 hours a week originated from that studio. So that was a very important step. At that time, there weren't people of color in any form of journalism, really, in newspapers or television or radio, except the white-owned, black-oriented music stations. So that was a very important turning point for me. Was my experience in Buffalo.
And that's amazing. I think, it being Black History Month, should embrace that. You came and seen there was a lack of diversity in the industry. And, you caused that shift in the culture. Um, can you kind of like talk about like some of those experiences in that time that, really help you shape that mindset into everything that you wrote in a mission statement? And, I could quote it. You said National Public Radio will serve the individual, it will promote personal growth, and it will regard the individual differences with respect to joy rather than derision and hate. So like maybe like talk about like what was some of the things that you might have seen, back in the 60s, 70s, early 70s that kind of really helped you to shape that mission statement.
Well, at that time, the 60s were very turbulent, and we had the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, and it was just a very turbulent time. The anti-war demonstrations, and so and it was in a way the similar kind of thing that people weren't respecting the diversity. The commercial stations were not giving voice, amplifying the voices of African Americans, and so there were demonstrations, but they would report on that, but not on really the underlying causes.
Right.
So that's the problem. So that's why I felt it was important, and not just to talk about problems, but to celebrate the Black culture. And so we've sponsored a Black Arts Festival, for example.
Hmm.
And we printed our program guide in the Challenger, which was the Black newspaper. So it would reach uh, people of color. And so my whole purpose was to to celebrate the culture, to understand the issues, the concerns in a civil way, and in a respectful way.
Exactly.
So the mission statement has a lot about diversity and celebrating the diversity, and that it will speak with many voices and many dialects. And that was really a very important point. It inferred also that the staff would be diverse.
Right.
I'll be talking about all this, of course, on March 1st
Yeah.
at that talk.
Yes. Do you feel like today, that mission statement is still upheld in the ways that you might have envisioned?
I'm surprised. I'm not trying to puff myself up, but the folks at NPR tell me that they think it's more relevant today than when I wrote it
Wow.
50 years ago.
Wow, that's amazing. That's amazing. I kind of want to switch it up here. So like I did a lot of research and back in days under your leadership, Fresh Air Terry Gross was really transformed from a local to national audience. Can you talk about like that journey and your vision for the talk show and even like you could even touch on some of your experiences with Terry Gross and how she like grew tremendously over the years?
So this is kind of inside radio stuff, but there were a lot of stations at that time. All Things Considered started at 5, and I wanted it to be the very first broadcast record of the day's news, because the television came on at 6:30, then PBS came on at 7.
Right.
So from the beginning, I wasn't shy about what I wanted NPR to become.
Yeah.
Um, and so some of the stations wanted it to start at 4. And the staff were saying, geez, it's hard enough to meet at a deadline at 5. 4 is really hard. So I thought, well, let's have Fresh Air be the lead-in to All Things Considered, be like kind of like the arts section of a newspaper.
Hmm.
Um, and so we developed it so that it was the interviews would be shorter as we got, they'd be the same length, for example, in the last half hour. So it would be a natural lead into the same pace, if you will, as All Things Considered. And to make it seamless, at about 50 minutes in, um, we had a promo on the air so that Terry would say, well, to Robert Siegel, who was the host, well, what do you have lined up for All Things Considered tonight?
Yeah.
So it sounded like they were in the same studio practically. And so it would be seamless. So that's why we designed it that way. And it worked.
That's amazing. So what would you say was your favorite Fresh Air interview of all time?
That's one of those questions I can't answer. Um, there were a lot of them, and I'll be playing a couple excerpts on Monday.
Okay, okay. I'm looking forward to that. Um, so Mr. Siemering, as we look back, like 50 years of NPR, what was one moment that you could say that you would never ever forget?
uh, well, I'll never forget the first program because we did produce a 23-minute documentary of the day's events,
Mm,
and that was a real accomplishment. Um, and so, um, but in Buffalo, getting back to that, if I will, um, one of the most meaningful times was when there were the riots at SUNY Buffalo. And they went on for 3 weeks. And we broadcast 140 hours of town meetings, of interviews, and so on. And so this was after I'd written the mission statement and all. And the Courier Express had written that it was a voice of reason and calm and gave us high marks. And that kind of gave me confidence that we were on the right track, you know.
yeah.
So as it happened, as I mentioned here, when I first day at NPR, we had the riots there. They're much larger, of course, but the principles were the same. Hearing from all sides of fairness and treating it objectively and respectfully. And
Yeah.
that's what we did. So in a way, um, that was like a trial run, if you will, or
Yeah.
uh, um, out of town broadcast rehearsal.
And that's amazing. And so like you've done like a lot of great things overseas, specifically with your organization, developing radio partners alongside your work with Open Society Institute. Can you talk about like the impact of radio on a global scale and how today COVID may have affected things and any plans that may happen?
Right. Well, I think the through line of my whole life career has been to make the case for radio. And I had done some work with Open Society, helping develop stations in South Africa after the change of government there in '94. And I knew the importance of it. In Africa, 80% of the information is by radio. And so we work in helping improve those local stations. And as a result, for example, um, with youth-friendly health services that we do in Malawi, it increased the number of youngsters going to get this information from the clinic from like 700 to 2,500 in 3 months. And uh, so that's kind of showing that's just one example of how it works. We also give stations money for community activities. And in some stations, they planted trees. And that was a pilot project for them so that later they were able to get funds from other organizations that support tree planting. And so perhaps thousands of trees were planted that way. And so it's a kind of seed money, if you will, that helped accomplish a lot. So, and getting to your point about COVID, in Sierra Leone, that's one of the poorest countries, um, they were hit by Ebola very badly. And at that time, the radio stations had a very active role in that. We had facilitated creating an independent radio network. And so all those stations really did a lot of, how to prevent getting Ebola, how to treat it, and so on. And so then when COVID hit, they knew how to do this, and so they had experts that would be giving them spots and interviews and answering questions. And so, and again, because they speak in local languages, many times there are many different languages in a country like that. And the radio station is the most trusted source because it's locally based. They go to the station when they have problems um, to get resolved and things like that. So I'm not saying that radio is the sole reason for this, but in Sierra Leone there have been only 79 deaths from COVID. Um, so I think the rate of granted its population is 7 million, but
Right.
um, there are also only 245 doctors there. So
Wow.
they're aware of how fragile their health system is. So they follow the instructions. They wear masks, they do social distancing. They do what they're told to do. Whereas here you've got people resisting
Yeah.
the most common sense kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate. But they know what to do. And so when the very first outbreak comes, um, they they you know
Mhm.
get serious about it right away.
Yeah. And so like what is one unforgettable experience that you may have encountered while traveling to all these places? What is one like unforgettable moment, you know, that you experience?
Again, you have a lot and a lot of different countries and so on. Um, I have to think about it. I guess I would stand by the way in which we've the stations have literally saved lives. That's about the most important thing. Um, and uh, and encouraged, given information on reproductive health and things like that, so that girls don't get pregnant when they're still in high school,
Yeah.
or get married off to some older guy, forced marriage.
Yeah.
And that information prevents that from happening. So I think for me, that kind of information is most important
Yeah.
to actually be altering people's lives for the better.
Mhm. That's amazing. So, I mean, just to wrap things up, like, where do you see radio and, NPR? What is the future of radio? A lot of people are really into the podcast kind of
Right,
thing now. Do you see kind of that opening up more, or like the traditional radio? Because honestly, for our generation, you know, we don't really like listen to, too much of, like, when we're in our cars and in our, we don't like really turn on, we're listening to podcasts, we're listening to streaming music and stuff like
right,
that. So, but it's really true that the radio is still going, there's still a lot of money in radio, and, that's
right,
still a thing. So where do you see that really heading, like, in the future?
right. Well, to your point, um, NPR has been on top of this, and you'll find that in the top 20 podcasts, radio is very well, public radio is very well represented out of 900,000 podcasts.
Wow.
And they have been on Spotify. There have been other, and you're right, an actual physical radio. Perhaps a lot of people of your generation don't even know what one looks like. Except maybe you first heard it when you were in a car seat and your mother was driving to get groceries.
Yes, sir.
But now there is streaming. They're on top of all these different um, ways of getting radio. So I think I would say we're living in the age of audio,
Right.
and you're on the right track with this, with Wildcat Radio, because um, with as I mentioned, over 900,000 podcasts,
Mhm.
and when you have the traditional print media like the New York Times and the New Yorker having radio programs, they're paying attention to it. They're paying attention to audio, and so I think the future is strong for audio.
Most definitely.
It's just a matter of, there's so many options, it's hard to be noticed. But I think the tradition of public radio has been established. And so people will find it in whatever format works for them.
Yes, sir. That's amazing. Listen, Mr. Siemering, I want to thank you for your time today. I think, you're truly inspiring, and everything that you've accomplished thus far, really served its purpose, especially for the Black community, and just really, defining, your vision for what diversity means in radio. Um, and so I want to thank you for that.
Thank you for this interview. It's been enjoyable to talk to. It's been enjoyable to talk to you.
Yes, sir.
I look forward to seeing you and meeting you again on on Zoom in a week.
I'll see you on the March 1st.
Okay. Thanks so much for your time.
No problem.